Shana Tova, once again. There's a place in the Torah called Be'er Lachai Roi. It's mentioned several times. Once as the place Isaac settles near after he and Ishmael bury their father Abraham. It's a place associated with grieving, which is something I've been reflecting on a lot lately. Grief and its relationship with solidarity, building and nurturing connections among and across communities. We first encounter Be'er Lachai Roi with Hagar when she is met by an angel at a well after fleeing from Sarai's abuse. The angel speaks to her gently, and she departs feeling witnessed. And she called Adonai, who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," by which she meant, "Have I not gone on seeing after God has seen me?" So the well is called Be'er Lachai Roi, well of the living one who sees me. A little later in Torah, we're told that Isaac has just come from Be'er Lachai Roi, at a time when he is grieving for his mother, Sarah, and no doubt wounded from his violent near death at the hands of Abraham. The medieval commentator Sforno says about this that Isaac had gone, quote, to pray in the place where the prayer of his mother's servant was heard. To pray in the place where the prayer of his mother's servant, Hagar, was heard. Now, on the surface, Hagar and Ishmael, her son, are banished from the family. They're no longer part of our story, so to speak. But here, and it's not the only place, this is challenged. Because Sforno's comment begs the question, how would Isaac have known about Be'er Lachai Roi? It's not a literal question. There's no truth to uncover. My point is that this strain of our tradition suggests that those broken family lines actually remain connected. The obvious answer to the question, how did Isaac know, is that Hagar or Ishmael told him. They told him about this place. They shared with him Hagar's experience of feeling seen and heard there at Be'er Lachai Roi. On the surface, the Torah is tribalistic. Yet the authors, our ancestors, snuck a lot through the cracks that expands the story and invites us to widen our sense of who we are. Inscribed in our origin story are remembrances of how our circle of belonging is larger than we often think. As Jews, we bear a lot of messages saying the opposite. For sound reason. Persecution, exiles, and a long list of catastrophes have shaped a sense that we are alone in the world, fundamentally unsafe alongside others, which at times we have been. We'll come back to this. For now, I want to pick up where we were. Shortly after we read about Isaac coming from Be'er Lachai Roi following his mother's death, Abraham dies. As I mentioned, after burying him with Ishmael, Isaac returns to settle there. So Be'er Lachai Roi is a place where Isaac grieves trauma and loss. A place he presumably was invited into by his brother's mother, Hagar, herself abused and banished by his parents. I imagine it as a locus of comfort and refuge, where one's hurt and grief can be held so unequivocally and lovingly that others' grief and others' humanity are likewise beheld and honored. This practice of grieving and bridging through grief feels like increasingly essential technology for us as a people and as a species as we travel through this tumultuous era. An era that, through wholehearted grief and other wisdom practices, might also have the potential for transformation. The rabbis passed down some very grounded wisdom about grief. It's something that we do well in Jewish tradition. For all our mishigas, I think there's some good wisdom there. When a family member dies, we're given a rhythm, aninut, limbo before burial, the week of Shiva, the month of Shloshim, then the first year. We don't just bury our loved one, then get back to quote-unquote life. We know that these steps are life, to not tend to them, to not place ourselves amidst the brokenness and aimlessness of them, is to sever from a life force we need to be comforted, to emerge, and to reconnect. Early in my time in Corvallis, an older woman in our community died whose adult son was Orthodox, so he had some specific halachic requests. But at the funeral itself, he demonstrated something that wasn't about the letter of the law, it was about the spirit of the law. He walked into the sanctuary as the funeral was about to begin wearing an old, worn-looking, short-sleeved plaid button-down with a huge rip down one side of the chest. Many of you know the ritual of kriya, tearing, in most of our cases, a black ribbon that we've pinned onto our shirt. The original ritual was to rip the garment itself, symbolizing the tearing of our hearts. And that was how this woman's son was observing it, as directly as possible, understanding that the tearing of material represented the tearing of his heart, and knowing it was designed to help him do that. So he took his old shirt and he ripped it, and he walked around with a huge flap of ripped shirt dangling. He looked ragged, not entirely together. As he walked up to the bima to give his eulogy, he had the copy of his words in one hand and a box of tissues. I remember this big box of tissues that he had in the other. His talk was punctuated by audible sobs, wiping his nose with the tissue, more weeping and wailing, laying the box of tissue back on the table. It was as if he was following a prescription. Not that he was manufacturing the feelings, but that he was not holding himself back in any way. To me, it felt like this public grieving was a medicine he knew to take. I don't want this story to be misunderstood. We don't all have to grieve like that. But this was one example of someone giving themselves over wholeheartedly to grief. There have been other moments when I've witnessed mourners inhabiting grief so fully as to lose control or go beyond what we might deem appropriate, kneeling in the soil by a graveside and crying out while taking fistfuls of earth to toss onto the casket, completely breaking down in the middle of a eulogy, unable to continue for several minutes. In our culture, people often apologize for this kind of emotional unraveling, even in times of great suffering. But this is what our ancestors knew to make space for. In November, the Othering and Belonging Institute hosted a webinar called Across Lines, Grief. Bayo Komalafe, Global Senior Fellow at the Institute, facilitated the conversation. The panelists spoke about grief on multiple levels, both intimate and collective. At one point, Bayo said, "We perform grieving as mutiny against established patterns." As mutiny against established patterns. We perform grieving, he went on, as a form of errancy, E-R-R, errancy, as a strain away from politics as usual, as a making space for our bodies to do different kinds of things in the world. He's suggesting that grief, by definition, changes us, breaks patterns, makes way for us to perceive one another more completely. Ali Abu Awad grew up in the West Bank in an activist family, aggressively resisting the occupation. After serving 2 sentences in Israeli prisons, he was shot in the leg by an Israeli soldier, then learned that his brother had been killed by one. This catastrophe sent Ali on a journey of great rage, yet one that ultimately transformed into a path of nonviolent resistance. A key moment was when an Israeli couple who had lost their son in a terrorist attack called his family and asked if they could come over. As they all sat together and shared their stories of loss, he watched the Israeli parents cry. I had never seen an Israeli cry, he later said. I didn't know they could. The entire IDF could not have stopped me from throwing stones during the first Intifada, but one single tear of an Israeli parent prevented me from going on a rampage. The encounter Ali is describing was with leaders in the group Parents Circle, Bereaved Families Forum. For them, the grief that each person shares, even across profound differences, is a bridge through which they come to understand each other. Like Be'er L'chai Roi, the space in which they each can grieve is also the locus of connection, where they refuse to surrender each other's humanity. Cicely Saraski, veteran Jewish peace activist and director of communications and narrative for the Othering and Belonging Institute, was on that November panel as well. She spoke movingly about the most personal of losses, her 18-year-old son dying a few years prior. In the moment that it happened, her neighbor, an Egyptian Muslim woman, heard Cicely and her wife crying loudly and came over to see what was happening. They had just found their son. And when the neighbor arrived and saw them all, she just wailed, Cicely said. She just wailed, and in the most alone moment of my life, I will never forget that expression of solidarity and love and accompaniment. I love how the word solidarity sounds along the words love and accompaniment. We generally think of solidarity as a political act, which of course it is, but we can lose sight of the heart-centered potential of that word. Just as Cicely's neighbor was performing an act of loving, caring solidarity, so our solidarity on a larger scale can be driven by love and care, by our hearts breaking for the ways in which any people are harmed and dehumanized, moving us to take steps to accompany them however we can. Which leads me to reflect on what solidarity means for us as Jews right now. Solidarity of others with us and our solidarity with others. And to do that, we have to consider our experience of and our conversation around anti-Semitism, which can feel like a barrier to solidarity, but has the potential to be a bridge. As we know, anti-Semitism has been on the rise for several years. White nationalist leaders have gained power, and the ranks of their followers have grown and become increasingly bold. Of course, in the US, this is manifested most horrifically in the Tree of Life massacre, and recent years have seen other physical attacks, including here in our own community, as well as vandalism and harassment that I know has impacted many of us. I've been reading a new book called Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Anti-Semitism by Shane Burley, a Portland-based journalist, and Ben Lorber. In using the word radical, they point to its Latin source, radix, meaning root. Only by understanding the root causes of this form of oppression, they write, can we work to tear it out at its roots. So they delve into the origins of anti-Semitism, how it first arose, how it has been maintained throughout the generations. They unpack the stereotypes and age-old conspiracy theories which demonize Jews and convey a dangerously distorted picture of our role in society. I want to name that within Havurah, we hold diverse experiences about this. I've spoken with many of you, and so I can tell you that there is a very wide range in our community in terms of how we each do or do not experience or perceive anti-Semitism right now. I wonder if we can pause, though, and simply hold the fact that so many of our hearts feel shaky during this time. I wonder if that's possible. For some of us, as Jews specifically, shakier than they've ever been. I'm not suggesting we put our politics on a shelf. I'm simply inviting us in this moment to accompany one another, just as we are. As part of their analysis, Burley and Lorber assert that in the Jewish community, we tell a story about anti-Semitism that hinders our ability to fight it. And that story says that anti-Semitism is eternal, that in non-Jewish society it has always been and will always be, and there's not much we can do about it. They, on the other hand, examine it in the context of other forms of oppression, ways it feeds those and is fed by them. And they offer a vision in which these oppressions can be understood and fought together. This current of anti-Semitism's inevitability runs strong, and this year has intensified it. The fears and sense of isolation for many have become much stronger. And the authors themselves, who are fierce critics of the Israeli response to October 7th, still acknowledge how painful it was when some activists on the left minimized Hamas's massacre. And of course, as violence continues to escalate and spread, regardless of the actions and inactions that brought us here, I know that for Israelis, as I hear from friends and colleagues, these days are terrifying. And that fear ricochets. As I hold our particular experience within the Jewish community right now, I can see how, through the vulnerability and precariousness in this time, a narrative is being reified that is not objectively true, which is that we are ultimately on our own. I believe that solidarity is not only necessary, but profoundly possible. And I'm shaped by my personal experience here. I, of course, have seen how some on the left have shown disregard for Israeli lives and in ways for Jewish humanity. But I have felt my closest interfaith partners alongside me every step of the way this year. Leaders passionately calling for a ceasefire, yet checking in with me often, inquiring about my experience, the experience of our community, some of them diligently mindful of how anti-Semitism can show up. I have not felt an absence of allies. And I share this to say that all of this is true. All of it. We can't and mustn't shy away from countering anti-Semitism for our sake and for everyone's. And we also need to see and embrace the genuine care and allyship that is available to us. We have a choice about whether to really lean into building bridges right now, especially with other communities who have been marginalized, some much more than the Jewish community in this country. One of the key learnings in solidarity work is that communities who are targeted are often pitted against each other by those in power looking to consolidate that power. Anti-Semitism in particular, as Eric Ward and others have explained, has been used for generations to drive a wedge between oppressed groups, to derail movements of people working for freedom and justice. Is solidarity risky sometimes? Of course. We don't get assurances that things will always feel safe for us. But I often think about what it's like for the most marginalized groups to organize in coalition. Groups who face unending racism or other forms of discrimination. Do they wait until all of their potential partners have learned and grown so that they're guaranteed to not face harm from their allies? If that were the case, some communities would never, literally never be in coalition. If there was a path through this that didn't involve risk, we'd all be on it. The Othering and Belonging Institute issued a statement last November about the war. In it, they wrote, "We call on all of us to hold each other's pain, to listen, and to cross our differences, no matter how seemingly vast, to work together to change the structures of marginalization and domination that harm us all. Even if they harm us in greatly different ways, we must find ways to bridge that distance. When we honor each other's unfathomable grief, we reclaim each other's humanity. So I bring us back to Be'er L'chai Roi. As I've spun this story and its commentary out, imagining these nearly severed relationships being tended, I ask myself, why? Why did Hagar and Ishmael invite Isaac there? After being cast out, left to die in the wilderness, what inklings of solidarity led them to let him in? Maybe they saw how he too was wounded. Maybe it's the same underlying current that drew the daughter of Pharaoh to rescue Moses from the river, even though he was from a people that her own father said should be feared, because she saw a human being. She saw someone in need, and she acted. You know, friends, I don't know if we have much choice at this point except to learn to live together. Not to tolerate and endure, but actually to radically accompany one another. And what I'm suggesting is that it's not something that goes against who we are. It's a capacity we first nurtured long ago, and one we have practiced, albeit intermittently, throughout the generations. But in ways that will take breaking from how we are conditioned, will demand a mutiny against established patterns. Awaiting us at the end of these holidays, the culmination of this season is Sukkot. The sukkah is an impermanent, fragile dwelling, a refuge, though not one that guards us from the elements, one that brings us further into relationship. As fall descends around us and we feel perhaps the sweet grief of those changes, we might also feel ourselves drawn more fully into solidarity with one another, reminded that we will only be safest in a safer world. May we help grow that world in the year to come. Shana Tova.